I'm looking at my student loan statement, and the number feels unreal. It's a six-figure sum that will likely follow me for most of my adult life. For years, I had been told not to worry about college costs, that a fund set up by my grandparents would cover everything. It was my safety net, my golden ticket to a future without this exact kind of crushing weight. The reason it's not here, the reason this debt is mine alone, is because my parents gave every last cent of it to my brother, Mark, to fuel a business idea that was doomed from the very start. The betrayal isn't just emotional, it's a quantified, itemized list of interest payments and a principal I may never pay off. The fund was my grandparents' legacy for me. They weren't incredibly wealthy, but they were frugal savers, and they wanted to ensure I had the one thing they felt was most important, an education without financial burden. They set up the trust when I was born, and it was a frequent topic of conversation throughout my childhood. My parents would proudly tell friends and family about it, about how I was all set for the future. That knowledge gave me a profound sense of security. It allowed me to focus on my studies, to dream about what I wanted to become without the looming fear of how I would ever afford it. It was a promise of a future they stole. My brother, Mark, was always the designated visionary of the family. While I was praised for being studious and responsible, he was lauded for his big ideas and his unconventional thinking. His ideas were often half-baked and lacked any real planning, but my parents saw it as raw ambition. They encouraged his risk-taking, framing his failures as learning experiences. I was the safe bet, the one who would follow a clear path. Mark was the wild card, the one who might just strike it rich, and they seemed to find that far more exciting. His potential was always seen as limitless, while my hard work was simply expected. The beginning of the end started when Mark, then 22, announced his grand business plan. He wanted to open a boutique shop selling artisanal, ethically sourced terrariums. He had no business degree, no retail experience, and a business plan that consisted of a few Pinterest boards and a lot of vague statements about brand identity. Any practical questions I asked were dismissed as negativity. My parents, however, were completely captivated. They saw him as the next great entrepreneur, a creative genius who just needed a little push to get started. They were blinded by the fantasy and deaf to the logic that screamed it was a terrible idea. Discussions at the dinner table shifted entirely to Mark's venture. They spoke in hushed, excited tones about seed money and initial investments. My father started using phrases like, "You have to spend money to make money." I was deep into my final year of high school, consumed by college applications and final exams, so I admit I wasn't listening as closely as I should have. When I did tune in, the talk was always about supporting family and believing in each other's dreams. It was all couched in such positive, loving language that it was impossible to see the financial disaster they were engineering behind the scenes, using my future as collateral. I started to get a knot in my stomach when I began asking practical questions about accessing my college fund. With acceptance letters rolling in, I needed to understand the logistics. My mother would wave her hand dismissively and say, "Oh, honey, don't worry about the boring details. Your father and I are handling it." When I pressed for specifics, they would tell me the money was in a complex investment portfolio and it wasn't wise to move things around just yet. They made me feel like I was being impatient and untrusting. They used my love for them as a tool to keep me from asking the questions that would have exposed their lies. Their gaslighting was subtle but incredibly effective. If I brought up the tuition deadlines, they'd accuse me of thinking they were irresponsible. "Do you really think we'd let you down?" my mother would ask, her voice filled with feigned hurt. It was a masterful tactic because it shifted the focus from their secrecy to my supposed lack of faith. As a teenager who loved and trusted her parents, it was deeply painful. I didn't want to be the source of conflict or disappointment, so I would retreat, reassuring myself that they knew what they were doing. I chose to believe their vague promises over the growing anxiety in my gut. Meanwhile, Mark's terrarium business, which he named Terra Nova, launched with an absurd amount of fanfare. He leased a storefront in the most expensive part of town. The launch party was catered, with a live band and fancy invitations. I remember looking around at all the extravagance and feeling a sense of dread. I asked my dad how Mark could possibly afford all of this. He put his arm around me and said, "We gave him a small family loan to get started, that's all. It's an investment in his future." The word investment should have been a blaring alarm, but I still couldn't fathom the truth. The first tuition bill was the real test. I had been accepted to my dream school, and I was overjoyed. I took the bill to my parents, expecting we would sit down and arrange the transfer from my fund. Instead, my father told me there was a better way. He explained that for tax reasons and market timing, it was smarter to take out a federal student loan for the first semester. He promised it was just a temporary measure, a formality until they could liquidate the assets in my fund without a penalty. He was so confident, so reassuring that I believed him. I filled out the loan application that very night. That first temporary loan was the first step down a very slippery slope. When the next semester's bill came, there was another excuse. The market had taken a dip, and it was a terrible time to sell the stocks in the portfolio. My father presented complex charts he'd printed from the internet to prove his point. He said we would be losing money if we accessed the fund now. "Just take out another small loan," he urged. "The interest rates are low and we'll pay it all off in one lump sum as soon as the market recovers." I was 18 and knew nothing about stocks. I just knew I trusted my dad. The pattern was set. Every 6 months, a new, elaborate excuse was presented. There was a problem with the bank, a delay in the paperwork, a strategic decision to wait for a better financial quarter. All the while, the loan amounts grew larger. I was working a part-time job just to cover my books and living expenses because I didn't want to ask them for anything more. I felt a constant, low-level hum of anxiety, but I kept pushing it down. They were my parents. They wouldn't steer me wrong. My life became a cycle of studying, working, and signing more and more loan documents. While I was accumulating debt, Mark's business was hemorrhaging money. Terra Nova was a ghost town. His overhead was astronomical, and his terrariums were so overpriced that they rarely sold. Instead of cutting his losses, he would just go to our parents for another injection of cash. He needed to make payroll. He needed to order new inventory. He needed to launch a new marketing campaign. Each request was met with an open checkbook. I could see the financial strain taking a toll on my parents. They looked tired and stressed, but they refused to admit that Mark's dream was a complete and utter failure. The tension in our house became unbearable during my visits home from college. Money was a forbidden topic. If I even hinted at my growing student debt, my mother would change the subject or claim I was being ungrateful. They were pouring every spare dollar into Mark's failing business, and they couldn't bear to face the reality of what they were doing to my future in the process. They were living in a state of willful denial, propping up my brother's ego with money that wasn't theirs to give. It was easier for them to silence me than to confront him and the consequences of their choices. There was a moment of false hope during my sophomore year. Mark announced he was partnering with a local interior designer. My parents were ecstatic, claiming this was the big break he needed. They gave him even more money to upgrade the store for this new partnership. They told me that once the profits started rolling in from this new venture, paying off my student loans would be the first thing they did. I allowed myself to feel a flicker of relief. Maybe they were right. Maybe this was all part of a larger plan that I just couldn't see. The hope was a brief, painful reprieve before the final crash. Of course, the partnership was a disaster. The designer used Mark's store as a free showroom for a few weeks, got some publicity, and then pulled out, leaving Mark with a mountain of new debt from the upgrades. That was the final nail in the coffin for Terra Nova. The store closed and the for lease sign went up. Mark moved back home completely defeated. My parents treated him like a returning war hero who had suffered a tragic noble loss. They coddled him, cooked his favorite meals, and told him how brave he was for trying. There was no accountability, only endless sympathy. By my junior year, the loan statements were terrifying. The total was approaching a sum I couldn't comprehend. The excuses from my parents had become flimsy and repetitive. I knew something was deeply wrong. I finally put my foot down and demanded the truth. I told them I wouldn't register for my senior year until they showed me the account statements for my college fund. I was done with the delays and the stories. I needed to see the numbers on the page. The demand hung in the air, and for the first time they had no easy answer. The room was silent as the weight of my ultimatum settled. The confrontation was uglier than I could have imagined. My mother started crying, accusing me of being cruel and heartless. My father just sat there, his face pale and drawn, but I held my ground. For hours they tried to deflect and manipulate, but I just kept repeating my demand. Show me the statements. Finally, late into the night, my father broke. With a shaking voice, he confessed everything. There were no statements to show me because the fund no longer existed. It had been empty for over 2 years. They had drained every single penny my grandparents had saved for me. He explained it all in a rambling, apologetic monologue. They hadn't planned to use all of it, just a little at first to help Mark get started. But the business kept needing more, and Mark kept promising that success was just around the corner. They invested more and more, always believing the next cash infusion would be the one that turned things around. They were chasing their losses, convinced that if they just put in a little more, they could make it all back. They used my entire future as a gambling chip in my brother's failing enterprise, and they lost everything. The next day, I drove to my parents' house to confront Mark. He was sitting on the sofa in the living room playing video games without a care in the world. When I told him that I knew about the college fund, he didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. He shrugged, his eyes still glued to the screen. "It was a business expense," he said calmly. "It was supposed to be an investment. It's not my fault the market for luxury terrariums is soft right now." He spoke as if my stolen future was a minor, acceptable loss on a company's balance sheet. His complete lack of remorse was what broke me. I screamed at him, I cried. I asked him how he could be so selfish. He finally paused his game and looked at me with genuine annoyance. "Why are you being so dramatic?" he asked. "It's just money. I was trying to build something for this family. You should have been more supportive." In his mind, he was the victim. He was the one whose brilliant dream had been crushed. My life-altering debt was merely an inconvenient footnote in the tragic story of his failed business. He truly believed he was entitled to my future. I turned my anger back to my parents. I needed to understand their rationale. My mother's explanation was a tangled mess of excuses rooted in blatant favoritism. She told me that I was strong and resilient, that she knew I would find a way to be successful no matter what. Mark, she explained, was more sensitive and needed the support. She said that a failure would crush him, whereas I was built to handle adversity. They handicapped my future because they had more faith in my ability to survive a crisis than in his ability to succeed. They punished my competence and rewarded his weakness. My father's justification was even worse in a way. He tried to frame it as a logical, albeit failed, financial strategy. He claimed that if Mark's business had succeeded, the returns would have been massive. "We could have paid for your college 10 times over," he insisted. He was still clinging to the fantasy. He admitted they had bet my entire college fund on a long shot, but he refused to call it what it was, a reckless, desperate gamble. They weren't investing in a business. They were enabling their favored son at the direct and devastating expense of their other child. The financial reality is a daily weight on my shoulders. I've taken on extra shifts at my campus job, and I'm living on the cheapest food I can find. I spend my nights poring over loan repayment plans instead of studying. The future I had planned, maybe graduate school or a down payment on a small apartment, has been erased. It has been replaced by decades of debt repayment. My parents' decision didn't just take away a sum of money. It fundamentally altered the course of my life, shackling me to a financial burden that was never supposed to be mine. My relationship with my family is in ruins. How can I ever look at them the same way? Every time I speak to my parents, all I can hear are their lies and justifications. Every time I see my brother, living at home without any responsibilities or debt to his name, I feel a surge of bitter resentment. They shattered my trust, not just with their actions, but with their complete inability to take meaningful responsibility for the damage they caused. They want us to move on as a family, but they don't seem to understand that they blew up the very foundation of what that meant to me. They offer empty apologies, saying, "We're sorry it didn't work out," as if they're talking about a cancelled vacation, not the theft of my financial security. They still don't seem to grasp the magnitude of their betrayal. They think that because they feel bad, it should be enough. My mother even suggested that once I get a good job after graduation, I could help the family get back on its feet, a suggestion so galling it left me speechless. They not only stole from my past, they are already laying claim to my future earnings to fix the mess they made. Now graduation is just a few months away. It should be a time of celebration and excitement. Instead, it feels like I'm walking off a cliff into an ocean of debt. Mark is already talking about his next brilliant idea, something about cryptocurrency, and I can see my parents listening with that same misguided hope in their eyes. It's clear they have learned nothing. They will continue to enable him, to shield him from the consequences of his actions, because that is the family dynamic they have built. He is the dream to be funded, and I am the workhorse expected to endure. I see a therapist at the university's counseling center now. We talk a lot about forgiveness and boundaries. She says I have to decide what I need to do for my own well-being. Part of me wants to cut them off completely, to change my name and disappear after graduation. I want to build a life where I am not constantly reminded of their betrayal. But another part of me mourns the family I thought I had. It's a profound and lonely grief, losing your family while they are still standing right in front of you. The most painful part is realizing that their love for me was conditional. It was contingent on me being the easy, self-sufficient child who never needed anything. The moment my needs came into conflict with my brother's wants, they made their choice without a moment's hesitation. They sacrificed my guaranteed future for his improbable one. I wasn't an equal member of the family. I was a resource, a backup plan, and ultimately a contingency fund to be liquidated for the sake of the golden child. This knowledge is a heavier burden than any student loan. So I'm posting this here anonymously into the void of the internet. I'm hoping to hear from someone who has been through something similar. What do you do when the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones who pushed you into the abyss? Is it possible to rebuild any kind of relationship from these ashes, or is the financial betrayal simply too great to overcome? I'm standing at a crossroads, with a diploma in one hand and a crippling debt statement in the other, and I have no idea which way to turn. The path forward is a fog,